And yeah.
Okay, great. Well, first, welcome everybody. For those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Todd Cutter. I'm an ordained minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I recently celebrated my 16th anniversary of ordination, but I also have training as a mental health counselor. I'm currently working part-time at Water's Edge Counseling in Savannah, Georgia. Whitney Owens is the director of the center. She's the one who had the vision and started Water's Edge. She is on with us right now. I think, Whitney, you're going to duck out of the meeting in about 15 minutes. And so I will do my best to kind of monitor the chat as I lead the presentation, but certainly you'll have some time for questions at the end. This is the third free webinar that I've offered for clergy and for church staff. The goal is that we'll offer one on the first Thursday of every month at 12:30 Eastern Standard Time. And so I have two requests of you. First, at the end of today's question and answer time, please be ready to let me know what topics you would like future webinars to address. I'm certainly not an expert on everything, but I'm always glad to do research and learn more about different topics that are out there. And second, if you find these useful, please let other clergy know about them and also other church employees. I think a lot of the issues that we face as clergy are now being faced by anyone who works in a church. At the last webinar, I shared that clergy experience a higher rate of anxiety and depression than others do when we look at other vocations. And someone said, well, can you go into more detail about why this is? And I'm glad that they did so. I want to say again that we're seeing anxiety and depression and stress issues, not just among clergy, but among those who do any sort of work for the church. Second, I think it's helpful for us if we are more aware of some of the common causes of stress, depression, and anxiety. Too often I fall into the trap myself of saying things like, but I'm exercising, I'm taking my day off, I'm trying to unplug when I can, and yet I'm still feeling stressed and anxious. So at least for me, this means the need to dig a bit deeper and consider that while I may have some good coping mechanisms, it's going to be necessary to take a hard look at both the internal stressors, the ones that I sort of bring on myself, because we do have some that we bring on ourselves, and the external stressors, everything from how I tend to think and react to the expectations of the church, to events in the world, to the needs that family presents. So I'm going to share my screen with you here, and we will go from there. If I can find what I'm looking for. Hold on, please bear with me. All right. Can everybody see this first slide? Yes, no? Can I get a nod? Is everybody seeing this?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right. So the first thing I want to talk about as we jump into this is generic third parties. This is a technique that I use quite a bit with couples, but I'd like to kind of start expanding it to individual work that I do with folks. Our individual mental health and emotional well-being is the focus here. It's our very selves that we're talking about. And so I want you to imagine that you see a rope tied to a post, kind of like the one in the picture. And then I want you to imagine that you pick up and you hold the loose end of that rope. Now, let's say I walk in and I grab the middle of the rope and I start pulling it towards me. Your first instinct is going to be to look at me, to ask, why are you pulling on the rope? But the moment you start to focus your attention on what's pulling on the rope, you forget that if I'm pulling on the middle of the rope, you're being dragged toward the post. And suddenly you hit the post. And then you have to deal with the injuries, with the pain, with the suffering that comes on. So I want you to think about those things that grab the rope as generic third parties. And when we maintain an awareness of the generic third party, but we primarily pay attention to what is happening around us and within us, we'll do a better job at avoiding hitting that post. Generic third parties can be anything. Generic third parties can be family. They can be our spouses or our partners. They can be the church. They can be meetings. They can be children. They can be a car that breaks down. And initially, I think that it's hard to think about some of those things as generic third parties. We don't want to think of our spouse as a generic third party. But when it comes to our mental and emotional well-being, anything that kind of pulls on the rope and causes stress and tension for us does become that third party. And we have to talk about the impact that it's having on us. And so to do this, I'd like to start with some general background information on stress, anxiety, and depression among clergy and church employees. So first, let's talk about some of the basic statistics that have bearing on this workshop. And you can find a full list of these by visiting the website down in the corner of the slide. First, 72% of clergy report working 55 to 75 hours per week, and 80% believe ministry has negatively impacted their family. 24% of clergy find that their family resents the church. 53% say that seminary does not adequately prepare us for the demands of ministry. 57% of clergy are unable to pay everyday bills. 75% can point to a stress-related crisis at least once in their ministry. 35% struggle with depression. 26% report being fatigued. 70% report a lower self-image than when they started ministry. And 57% say they're fulfilled, but even though they can say they're fulfilled, they're also discouraged, stressed, and fatigued. And this for me was probably one of the most shocking, is that 1 in 10 will retire as a pastor. In other words, that the likelihood that many of us will leave ministry before retirement age is pretty significant. And some of that, of course, is our own stress and anxiety and all the issues that contribute. But of course, some of that too is there are cases that we know of where clergy are forced out of the career, where they are let go from a church, or a church closes and they're never able to find their way back into serving. So that last statistic does have some other contributing factors to it. So what all these statistics mean is that working in a church is taking a toll on us in a variety of different ways. And here are some of the ways that it's taking a toll. First, let's put it in perspective with some of the other helping professions, and only on the issue of burnout. We tend to burn out less than first responders, but we burn out at the same rate as teachers and social workers, and we burn out more than mental health counselors. I could not find good data on how we compare with the rest of the working world in terms of burnout, but there is plenty of data suggesting that when we compare our vocation to other vocations, the stress, anxiety, and depression is much more common. In fact, among Lutheran pastors, males have a depression rate 3 times that of the national average, and females have a depression rate 4 times that of the national average. Which as a Lutheran, I go, oh my gosh, what does that say about the Lutheran Church? But those rates are higher. And one way that we can combat stress and anxiety and depression is being more aware of some of the root causes. So as a whole, pastors report that seminaries don't do a very good job of teaching us the markers of stress, depression, and anxiety. Yes, we're encouraged to model self-care, and we're taught to provide pastoral care to others, but how many of us had a class devoted to the causes, symptoms, and possible treatments for stress, anxiety, and depression? So in short, it seems like we need to be teaching seminarians more about psychology than we currently do. In fact, the average seminarian graduates with the same psychological knowledge as someone who's taken a Psychology 101 class in college. When we start looking at stress, we then realize that it quickly leads to a downward spiral. The more stressed I become, the more anxious I feel. The more stressed I become, the more likely I am to experience depression. And then it becomes a nasty cycle. When I'm depressed or when I'm anxious, suddenly I'm more stressed, which exacerbates the depression and the anxiety. So part of our goal then becomes breaking the cycle before that downward spiral continues. And for this cycle to end, we have to do one of two things. We either have to eliminate the stressor, or we have to change our responses to the triggers. And this is problematic for several reasons. But the biggest reason is that stressors and the response to them are individually driven. What I find stressful, you might find enjoyable. And I may respond completely differently to a stressor than you do. So regardless of that sort of individually driven piece, there are some common factors for us to be aware of. One thing to be aware of is the timing of the stress. What else is happening in our lives when the stress comes in? For that matter, what else has happened during the day? Are there times that we're more tired? Times that we're more likely to feel more stress simply because of weariness? Also, what is our previous history of anxiety and depression? Particularly with depression, it's helpful to know that the age of onset is important. The younger a person is when they experience depression, the more likely it is to reoccur in their life. Also, the more severe depression is the first time we experience it, that raises the likelihood that it will increase, that it will happen again, and that the severity will be even higher. This is why we're so very worried in the mental health field when we see like 12, 13, 14-year-olds having severe depression, episodes of depression, because it generally means they're going to have these again and again throughout their lives. We also have to look at the intensity of the stressor. Are we able to brush it off? Does it last a short period of time or a long period of time? Is it a constant? Is it random? And we also have to look at context. The stressors vary from church to church, from geographic location to geographic location. And that's important for us to remember because, as I'll mention later, we are a mobile group. We change calls. And so, for example, I served from 2008 to 2018 in Ohio, and I'm now in Savannah, Georgia. And I would say the stressors in the South are different than the stressors in the Midwest. So again, we also have to deal with the very individualistic piece of it, that it's an internal and an external issue. What's our response, and what do other people demand of us? And finally, it's important to remember that there is no universal threshold of stressors that will result in anxiety and depression, and that anxiety and depression can range from mild to severe. So if everything is individually driven, what's the purpose of a workshop like this? Wouldn't we be all better suited to seek individual therapy? Well, yeah, I'm a big fan of individual therapy, not only as a therapist, but also as someone who has sat on the other side of the couch numerous times in my life. But on the other hand, I think it's good for us to look at some of the things that typically cause the most stress for clergy and church employees. If we're aware of them, we can watch out for them more. And some of these may be familiar to you, and at the same time, I hope others are things that you haven't even thought of, that you'll be surprised to find that something could be a stressor that you haven't yet considered. All right, so the first stressor is numerous demands and conflicting expectations. Working for a church involves both of these. All too often, the feedback that we receive is subjective. People respond to how they feel. And this is the big issue I have with most employee evaluations in churches. We're not evaluated on whether we completed the tasks set before us. Like, did we show up every Sunday? Did we lead worship? Were we present for funerals and weddings? Instead, our evaluations often take this term. Well, I didn't like it when you preached on this subject, or I don't feel like you stay long enough when you visit people in the hospital. So that's subjective. That doesn't help us any. It's all based on feelings. Furthermore, it's no surprise that we are often evaluated on the ABCs: attendance, buildings, and currency. Who among us doesn't worry every time attendance drops or giving decreases or a building becomes overly difficult to manage? And so if we are evaluated by a council or an executive team or even another clergy, I know sometimes in senior and associate roles, the senior pastor will do the evaluations. Look at the evaluation tool. It may fall to us to call out subjective evaluations and request something that's more objective. Another thing we need to be aware of is conflicting roles. We are expected to be scholars. We're expected to be those who maintain a strong awareness of biblical knowledge, denominational information, and the history of the church body and the church that we serve. But we're also expected to be priests, those who lead worship, preach, preside at sacraments. We're expected to be pastors. We're expected to provide care, to give support, to handle administration, to do general leadership. And very few of us are equipped in all three areas. And while we may celebrate what we're good at, we often end up focusing most of our time on what we aren't doing well, right? We say things to ourselves like, well, I'm a failure because that sermon wasn't my best work. Or I let people down because I didn't make it to all of my visits this month. Or I tend to push off work related to weddings because I find them boring and time consuming. When we feel weak in one area, stress occurs. And when others identify weaknesses in an area, stress increases. More often than not, we are pulled away from the activities that we enjoy and that we are good at. And we end up spending so much time on the things that are draining that our on threshold for stress is lowered and our anxiety and depression rises. We also have to deal with different systems. We're a mobile group. We change calls. What worked in one place or what we did well in one place might fall flat in another. And so we have to constantly relearn a system and what works, which is a stressor. Also, patterns in congregations can shift on us. I mean, just look at what's happened to all of us in the past 3 months. We have had to shift from in-person worship to live streaming and more of a social media presence. And it's taking our time because something has shifted in the congregation itself. Pardon me, I've gone forward too far. I don't know about you, but I find myself falling into this trap. Oh no, I spent too much time working on that video and I didn't schedule some sort of online event for the youth group. And all of a sudden I focus on what I didn't do and where I'm falling short, and the stress rises. One of the challenges we have as well is that we deal with an unpredictable schedule. Most of our ministry is based on someone else's schedule, not ours. As Gallagher and Christie say in a paper that they wrote on clergy, stress, and depression, we are called to lead, placate, challenge, stir, promote, teach, reach, evangelize, and educate 100% of the time, and we have to be available to others 100% of the time. Time management becomes an issue, and our stress increases when we don't finish tasks, when we are interrupted, when we get redirected by everything from a sudden death to a family member's illness to a flat tire. And what I thought was like most shocking is that there's been some studies done that say pastors deal with 41 different activities on any given day. 41. Like that to me is shocking that that much can come up. But I think if we all sat down and made a list of everything we deal with on any given day, we would find that, yeah, there are a lot of different things that might slide into place. Another role of stress for us are the unspoken rules And I'm not talking about the church rules. I'm talking about our own unspoken rules about what it means to be a pastor. Some of the ones I'm most familiar with are, you must always be a non-anxious presence. My favorite is, pastors can't throw hissy fits. Emotions must always be in check. That we must do whatever it takes for the sake of pastoral care, even if it means compromising our own beliefs or our own theological understanding. And one of the other rules are those things that we set for ourselves, which are, I'm only successful when. I'm only successful when I accomplish these tasks. I'm only successful when there are 200 people in worship. I'm only successful when 8 people comment on what a great sermon it was. And so we have these unspoken rules that float in, and when we feel like we're breaking them, our stress rises, which again contributes to anxiety and depression. As clergy and church employees, we also struggle with role ambiguity. We tend to lose our personal identity because our name becomes synonymous with the title of pastor or church employee. And when that happens, we sometimes take on a false identity, right? We have the front that we present, and that means we lose the opportunity to have real relationships. Most clergy have a very difficult time differentiating between socializing and working. So much of our time is tied up with events, with church members, that when we put on that false identity, it means that we are always on guard. We're fearful that when we cease to be anything more than the pastor, or I'm sorry, not fearful, but rather when we cease to be anything more than the pastor, our realistic self is lost. And without real relationships, we tend to grow extraordinarily lonely. The highest factor, the highest thing people name for reasons they left ministry is that they were lonely. And we are unprepared for loneliness when we leave seminary because we've just spent 4 years surrounded by people going through exactly the same things we do, having cookouts with them every Friday night, drinking beer with them on Saturday. And those people don't all come to the same church and live in the same town, right? And so we're not preparing our seminarians very well for that sense of loneliness. Outside of role ambiguity, there's also issues with conflict. There's growing evidence to suggest that clergy and church employees are not adequately trained to deal with conflict. And when conflict arises, we tend to bear the brunt of it. People from all sides come to us to let us know their opinion, and they're also very quick to let us know what our role is in that conflict. Most who name it rarely see their own role in it, and often demand that we do something about it right now. So I once served a church where there were 2 fully grown adults who had issues with 2 teenage boys in the congregation. And the boys and the 2 adults liked sitting in the balcony during worship. And I was approached one day by the adults and told that I needed to tell those boys that they were not allowed to sit in the balcony because the adults had been church members longer and they should have first dibs on where to sit. When I told them that I was not going to do that, they quit coming to church forever. And you know what I did? I went, oh my God, I've ruined somebody. I've driven somebody from the church. And my stress and my anxiety over an issue as silly as where people sit was problematic. So it's just this kind of ongoing thing for us. And the challenge, I think, is if we avoid conflict at all costs, it's going to create power vacuums. And the strongest people in the church are going to step right into those power vacuums. And let me tell you, just because somebody is strong as a leader, it doesn't mean that they're the best person to fill that void. And so we sometimes end up with bigger problems, because now nobody ever handled the conflict around the altar guild. And now the person who's running it is like a holy terror who spends money left and right without checking with anybody, just because he or she thinks that, I don't know, that the oil in the candles needs to come directly from Jerusalem or something like that, right? So we have to watch out that if we don't take on conflict, we may end up creating power vacuums. The other issue that I think all of you are probably fully aware of are church bullies. The church, more than any other system, allows for dysfunctional behavior. And so we continue as a church to allow mean-spirited, abusive church members to constantly and consistently attack church leaders. In many cases, the people who are engaging in these abusive and bullying behaviors may actually have a personality disorder, but none of us are trained in the markers of personality, or most of us rather are not trained in the markers of personality disorders and how to deal with the extremes of those when they come up. So common bullying techniques you're all familiar with. Other people are saying, that is like number one bullying behavior. I'm going to come to you and let you know that I'm not just mad, but there's a whole host of unnamed people who are as well. There are the nasty notes, sometimes anonymous, sometimes signed, the emails, the phone messages. There are statements like, I've gotten rid of other people, I'll get rid of you too. Or, if I can survive Pastor X, who was the worst pastor I ever served with, I can survive you until you're gone. And then there's the gossip. Here's what I've noticed about church bullies, and I wonder if you all have noticed this as well. Some of the most insidious bullies are the most kind and loving people face to face to others, and the congregation adores them. And if we say, this person is causing problems, everybody goes, oh, not Martha. Martha's just a beloved saint in this church. And so we have these people who are very adept at tearing us down as church leaders, but also very adept at presenting a different front to others. They're quite duplicitous. And I think that raises stress and anxiety for us. One of the other challenges for clergy is also the lack of emotional support. Those of us in ministry tend to experience more negative interaction from church members than positive interaction. And the more demanding a congregation is, the higher our tendency for burnout, anxiety, and depression will be. Studies have shown that the more positive feedback a pastor receives from his or her parish, the more likely it is that that person will have better buoyancy, that person will deal better with some of the typical ups and downs. My psychiatrist that I know, because she treats me, recently asked me 2 questions about the church. She said, Todd, when is the last time someone in your church complimented you with specifics, not just nice pastor, but when is the last time someone in your church complimented you with specifics? And then she said, when is the last time someone in your church actually asked how you were doing and offered support? And those are tough questions to struggle with, because for some of us, we can say, oh my gosh, it happens all the time. And for others of us, we can say, I think somebody told me they liked that Christmas Eve service 7 months ago, right? So when's the last time we've heard these things? All right. We also have challenging colleagues. Clergy are not always kind to one another. We are judgmental. If your denomination has a clergy Facebook page, I urge you to never read it or visit it. We tear each other down. We say things to each other. We critique words and actions. Why did you do it that way? You should have done it this way. My favorite is, you're a terrible preacher if you don't address this particular topic in the pulpit this week. Comparison is the thief of joy, right? But who among us doesn't compare ourselves to others? Because even like outside of the like really like gross stuff that I see on some clergy pages, there's also my colleagues that that post things like, boy, today we had 37 adult baptisms and the offering was $150,000. And, and it's like, oh my gosh, why can't I be like? And so we bring stress onto ourselves when we compare ourselves to others. All right, I'm going to warn you, personal rant and soapbox coming up. Requirements. This for me is becoming a deeper issue, and it's one that I wish I could better communicate to the leaders in our churches. At least in my setting over the past years, and I'm not talking about my individual church, I'm talking about the church body. The larger church body has started to require more of us while not taking anything away. And I want to give you a for instance. About 6 years ago, the denomination I'm a part of started requiring a boundaries training workshop. And we were told that we would need to repeat this every 5 years. It sounds good, right? Boundary training is important. Please don't hear me as saying, don't email your bishop and be like, that Todd Cutter said that boundary training is not important. Boundary training is important. However, over the past year, a move has been made, at least in the area where I serve, to make boundary training a requirement every year. Every year to attend a boundary training workshop. And suddenly there's a new stressor. What if I can't make the workshop on the date selected and that means I have to drive 3 hours to make the alternate one? What if they refuse to live stream it because they insist that we have to be in person for these things? What does that do about childcare, especially if your spouse is a pastor and has to be present as well? What I'm driving at is that boundary training isn't bad because it's a good thing. What I'm driving at is there's addition without subtraction, increased demands on our time with little else being removed as a requirement. And at least for me, there's one more stressor, and it's this. If I speak up too much about this with church leadership, am I shooting myself in the foot? Because these are the people who have to sign off on paperwork when I want to leave. Like, where's the line to say, I disagree with this, and please don't cut me from being considered from calls for the rest of my life. These are some of the church things that happen, but we also have family issues. How we connect with our spouses, our partners, and our children, or how we fail to do so, can also weigh heavily upon us. When clergy spouses were interviewed for a recent study, they reported that they believe their spouse or partner is overworked. They also reported that as the spouse or partner of clergy, they feel underappreciated by church members or are expected to fit a certain mold. They say that they wish that their partner would be in another vocation, that they feel pressure to do things they don't want to do, that they are neglected and have no privacy, that their social life is inhibited, and that they deal with Jekyll and Hyde syndrome. The pastor is kind and caring around church members, but comes home angry, tired, and frustrated. And so when we learn these things, that our families are finding our career stressful, it adds an additional level of stress for us. How do we juggle all this? How do we hear this and respond to it in healthy ways? Among clergy, there are also financial concerns. By virtue of our education, we are in the top 10% of educated learners in the United States, but we rank among the lowest paid. In fact, about 75% of professions that have a similar education level make more than we do. Also, salary is based on church size. So we have to fight financial battles every time we change a call. And there's always things like medical bills, student loans. There are all these other burdens that weigh on us when it comes to finances. Another burden for us can be our family of origin. More and more, when I do counseling with folks, we always get to family of origin. Studies show that 70% of clergy come from dysfunctional homes. And the most common line of thinking among clergy, whether we know it or not, is that entering ministry will allow us to right the wrongs and injustices from our own upbringings. And here I'll share a little bit of my story with you. My dad's a retired pastor. And many times I've realized that part of the draw for ministry for me was that I wanted to fight the battles that I saw my dad refuse to fight. What's interesting is that there is a correlation. Clergy from dysfunctional homes are more stressed, depressed, and anxious than those who are not. And then we have the issue of self-worth. Self-worth is a significant issue when talking about stress. Often the negative messages we feed ourselves, those cognitive distortions, become our reality, even if they are not true. And there is danger in repeated messages. There's been lots of different studies on this, but this is my favorite. Let's say I find out who the next 20 people are that you're going to see in the next 3 hours, and I call all of them. And I'm looking at my screen and I see Chad first. So I'm going to use Chad's name. And I say, all right, when you see Chad, I want you to say to Chad, oh my gosh, Chad, are you feeling okay? You look like you're sick. Well, the first couple people who say that, Chad's going to say, what? I'm fine. What are you talking about? But with the repeated message, eventually Chad's going to go, you know, I am feeling warm. And I did wake up tired. Yeah, I bet I am sick. There's value in repeated, or there's strength in repeated messages. So when we continue to feed ourselves negative messages, we begin to believe that they're true. There is also some evidence that people who enter church work with low levels of self-worth hope that they're going to subtly gain feelings of worth by serving others. And it doesn't take us too long to realize that the church doesn't resolve these issues. Instead, it exposes them. So that's 15. That's 15 stressors that immediately come to mind. And I'm sure that you could throw out any number of other stressors. But when these come at us, whether it's in the church or out the church, whether it's from ourselves or from others, they quickly lead to feeling overwhelmed and defeated. And that can lead to burnout. And one of the most helpful charts I've seen on burnout is the one that you're seeing now. It tells the difference between stress and burnout. Stress is marked by over-engagement. Burnout is marked by disengagement. When we're stressed, our emotions are overreactive. When we're burnt out, our emotions are blunted. With stress, physical damage or damage to our health is primary. With burnout, emotional damage is primary. Stress causes disintegration. I'm not talking about like we get disintegrated. Disintegration here means that we suddenly find that we have a lack of unity, that we no longer have a predictable set of beliefs, attitudes, traits, and behavioral responses. Like something might set us off one day that wouldn't another day. Burnout is demoralization. Stress, our bodies will respond with depression because it's produced by the body's need to protect itself and conserve energy. In burnout, depression is caused by grief, and it's caused by the loss of ideals and hope. With stress, there's a sense of urgency, almost hyperactivity. I've got to do this now. Burnout, there's a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. Stress produces panic, phobias, and anxiety. Burnout produces paranoia, depersonalization, and detachment. And this chart cuts to the core for me. But it also raises my anxiety and depression. Why? Because if I'm in a burnout situation, I know the call process can take months or even years. And suddenly I feel the stress of being stuck and the stress of having to continue to pay a mortgage, care for self, care for loved ones. And I'm stuck in a place where I'm just completely burned out. So what happens with all this stress, which fuels depression and anxiety? Well, common responses are alcohol use. Clergy use alcohol at 2 to 4 times the national average. Another is sleep issues. We have trouble falling asleep. We have restless sleep. We wake up and our mind races. All of this leads to an overwhelming sense of tiredness. And when we aren't rested, we are more anxious and more likely to struggle with depression. How many of us have ever said, I'm just tired all the time? Our diet and nutrition sometimes suffer. Statistics indicate that about 60% of clergy report being overweight. When we self-medicate with food, when we tend to eat on the run, Sometimes we even schedule meetings during our lunch break because it's a more efficient use of time. And there's more and more studies being done that say poor diet can exacerbate stress, which then leads to poor health and even increases the likelihood of becoming depressed. Common response is a lack of exercise. We're busy. We often don't have time for it. But exercise is one of the best ways to combat anxiety and depression because it processes adrenaline, it gets the frustration and the tension out. And when we don't have those opportunities, we grow more anxious and depressed. We also overfunction. In an attempt to gain appreciation and positive feedback from the people we serve, we try to do everything and we try to be everything. And the issue with this is that churches continue to applaud pastors who work insane hours. They're asking us to overfunction. And then the last one is when we begin to struggle with our own beliefs. Yes, we question, we doubt. That is good, that is fine, that is important. But when we're in an extremely difficult place with our own belief, we sometimes feel like frauds. We say, I don't even believe what I'm preaching and teaching anymore. And friends, when we go down that path, the anxiety grows and the depression increases. What if people find out that I don't believe this? Why am I doing something I don't really believe in? Another response can be the development of personality disorders. This one's tough to hear. When our sense of self is damaged, we struggle to bolster our own self-image. And when we cannot bolster our own self-image, it can manifest in personality disorders. The three most common for clergy are compulsive personality disorder, which is a pervasive pattern of preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and mental control, all at the expense of flexibility, openness, and efficiency. Compulsive pastors are the toughest ones to work with. We probably all know that associate pastor who says, boy, that senior pastor was so controlling, right? Those are the toughest ones to work with. The other that we can develop is a codependent personality disorder. We only feel valued when people need us, so we fill up our calendars with church activities until there's no room for a personal life. We can't say no. And churches will gladly enter into this relationship with us because if we are constantly doing things for others, they don't have to do them themselves. So they can under-engage and let you over-engage. Another one is narcissism. Narcissism is when we are plagued by emptiness and despair. We demand attention, exaggerate circumstances and situations, and exploit church members for our own advantage. Fun fact, narcissism in clergy tends to develop during midlife or around the halfway point of one's career. Suddenly, I'm not so glad that I've been ordained for 16 years. When I was completing my counseling degree, I remember one of my professors saying, look, whenever we study personality disorders, every single one of us will freak out and think, oh no, I have a personality disorder. So what we do is we watch for hints of this in our own lives. And when we recognize them, that's the time to act, right? Or we'll become like that whole frog in the water thing. The heat slowly increases and suddenly we're boiling. And the last thing that we can develop are irrational beliefs. These are the cognitive distortions I've talked about in previous webinars. We become so convinced that our success is measured by church size, or that church members can only see the best side of us, or that we're not relevant, or that every sermon must be a home run. And when these irrational beliefs take root, our anxiety and depression increases. So by now, I'm sure that you're thinking, wow, this is the most depressing webinar ever. However, I want to share some techniques with you because I think these are things you might find helpful as you attempt to manage the stress, the anxiety, and the depression. And the first is continuing education. Why on earth we insist that continuing education is just church related is beyond me. Like, what about taking a class in conflict resolution? What about, so that we can be more prepared to deal with that? What about picking up a business management class? With online classes increasingly available, these might help us with our own personal finances or give us skills for the church. How about we take a class at a gym, yoga or aerobics or whatever? If our church bodies are pushing health and wellness, why can't continuing education dollars be used for our personal health and wellness? Some people I know do a weekend with colleagues. Sure, you're not going to get a certificate for this, right? But so you sit around, you share in conversation, and you enjoy the flavor of a different city. And with continuing education, I like the arrive early or stay late rule. One of my favorite things to do when I'm going to another city is to get there a day early or to stay a day late just so I have a little bit of time to rest and relax. And more, I'm starting to shy away from continuing education events that are all church related, because I'll confess to you, if I go to a preaching conference, either I end up feeling like a terrible preacher, or I end up wondering why I wasn't invited to preach, because whoever's up on the stage doesn't seem like they can preach their way out of a wet paper bag, right? So there's this stress that comes up for these types of things too. My other technique I call the Mary Lou rule. Now, this is not anything else beyond my internship supervisor was named Mary Lou, and she insisted that I split the day into thirds and that I take a third of every day off. In other words, if I had a meeting in the morning if I had events in the morning and meetings in the evening, I was to take the afternoon off. And during that time, I was not to do anything church related, no phone calls, no sermon work, nothing, that I was to use that just for myself. And the Mary Lou rule, it combats those compulsive traits and that sense of over-functioning. For you Gen Xers, a little throwback, the just say no. The psychiatrist I mentioned earlier asked me one time if I'm able to say no to church members. And she said, if someone needs to talk and it's not an emergency situation, are you able to say, I'm sorry, I have to schedule a time with you? Now, this for some people is extremely hard. So whether you use a paper calendar or an electronic calendar, if you struggle with saying no, I want you to create a heading for each day or each week that consists of simply the word something. And when you are overwhelmed and you need to say no, then you can honestly look someone in the eye and say, I'm sorry, I have something on my calendar. Now, I know this sounds silly, but this is a first step for people who just struggle with saying no. Another technique is lunch break. Y'all, every other profession gets a lunch break and coffee breaks throughout the day, and they're not expected to do work. When I worked in a clothing store in seminary and I had a break, I wasn't expected to restock the shelves. I was expected to sit in another room that was separated from the rest of the store and fully take my break. When we insist on working through lunch or setting up lunch meetings, we're denying ourselves that moment to recharge and to rest our brains and our bodies. Another technique I'd recommend to you is what I call the simple journal. When we spend so much time writing, the idea of taking up journaling can feel overwhelming. And so I like the idea of a simple journal. Every morning, write out one positive thought for the day, a mantra, if you will, that you hope to follow, and then write one goal for the day. At the end of the day, the goal does not have to be work-related. It can be simple or it can be complex. Today, I will spend 30 minutes reading my favorite book. Today, I'll play a board game with my child. Today, I'll run 3 miles. At the end of the day, you write down 3 positive things that happened, that you're proud of, that went well, that you accomplished. And then suddenly you have a running log of successes that you've been able to achieve and a running log of positives that you're seeing. The part about ending the day with positives is important. There's a study done where they took 2 groups of people and they had one group watch sitcoms right before bed and they had another group watch crime dramas right before bed. And those who watched lighthearted comedies reported sleeping better and being more rested than those who watched things like crime dramas. And so ending on a positive note is helpful for us as well. I'd also like to introduce to you what I call what is called the behavioral chain analysis. I can't claim that I call it that because it sounds like I invented it. I did not. This is an activity that you go through after a particular event. You start by identifying when an event has happened, you start by identifying a vulnerability. What factors or what events were raising your sense of feeling vulnerable? What was the prompting event? What started the chain? And always look for some event in your environment, even if it doesn't seem like the environment caused the behavior. Then you identify your thoughts. What were you thinking before you started acting out? And we'll get to what acting out is in just a moment. Then you identify your emotions. What emotions were you feeling? What emotions were you trying to avoid? And then also, what were your body sensations? Was your body tense? Was it hot? Was it cold? How did it feel? And then you identify the problem behavior or the acting out. Now, the problem behavior is something specific, like I had a panic attack, or my heart started racing, or I found myself crying, or I was yelling. Those are what we call the acting out behaviors. And I know acting out sometimes has a negative connotation, but like what was the response that you gave that that you want to work on? And then you look at the consequences. Here are the consequences. How did you feel afterwards? What effect how did you feel later in the day? What effect did it have on your environment, on the people and the places around you? And then you go into solution analysis, which is where could I put skills or techniques along the way to decrease the likelihood of the problem behavior? Do I need to insert a behavior after the thoughts? Do I need to do something different when I see the prompting event? Do I need to do something different when I feel the emotions? And these are all ways to break the chain to keep us from going into those places that are challenging for us. I also like to suggest daily downtime. I mean, hello, even God rested. And for those who don't feel like they can do an hour a day, break it up into 2 or 3 20-minute breaks. These are for things like drinking your favorite coffee, contacting a good friend, taking a walk, engaging in an activity that relaxes you like knitting or coloring or painting. And the point is to let your mind rest for a little bit. Because it can be hard to unplug, it might be helpful to repeat the mantra to yourself, this is my time to relax. So that if you're doing your 20-minute break and you start thinking about something churchy, you can say, nope, this is my time to relax. The good news is the world is not going to fall apart if we take a 20-minute break. That if there's something so pressing that it can't wait 20 minutes, then we're going to know that we need to respond to that. We also have to work on setting boundaries. This one is a bit more of a broad brushstroke because we're all comfortable with different limits. And the first thing we have to do is decide what our boundaries are. Setting them takes work. And here's the most challenging piece. When we change, others have to change too. And setting boundaries is a form of change. Some of you have children. You know that when you set a boundary with a child, the child's going to push the boundary just to see how far it can go. Well, reversing an old saying, adults are like children, only older. Adults will push boundaries too. They will see if they can get us to stretch the boundary or to break it. So here's some ways to start setting boundaries. Script them. Write out what your response will be. For example, the phone rings at 7:45 p.m. The person on the other end says, Pastor, I'd really like to talk to you about the newsletter. You respond, I hear that's important to you, but I have to put my child to bed. I'll be back in the office tomorrow at 9. Their response, but Pastor, it'll only take a minute. At that point, your response will show if you're sticking to your boundary or not. And so sometimes having responses written out that you can refer to may help you stay on task. Here's one I know I need to tuck away, which I seldom do. Gosh, I'm sorry, worship starts in 5 minutes. We're going to have to talk about this later. You also need to communicate your boundaries, share them with your church leadership. One of the ones I break most often is the quick phone call or email on my day off. And then I tend up thinking about church all day. So share with the church. I don't check my email on Friday. If you email me on Friday, I may not see it until Saturday or Sunday. Or I don't take requests for announcements 5 minutes before a service starts. You or your committee needs to submit those by Thursday at noon or whatever. Boundaries are about keeping yourself sane and healthy. And in the church, you can look at boundaries around all aspects of ministry. The challenge is that we often go back on our own boundaries, and here's why. Because people still treat us the same as they did when we tried to change. And so we think, well, that didn't work, so I might as well go back to what I was doing. And this is actually what happens with those struggling with addictions. They get clean and sober, and their support group treats them the exact same way they did before they got clean and sober. And so many say, oh, well, I mean, I might as well go back to using the substance. So thus, it may be necessary for us to state and restate our boundaries until they sink in and others accept them. I like the list maker. My favorite things. Step one, list activities that you find enjoyable, distracting, or relaxing. Make that list accessible. And when you are stressed, anxious, or depressed, pull that list out and choose one of the activities. Step two of that is to look over the list and see if there are activities that can be done in groups. Do some research. Are there groups that gather for these types of things in your city? Because often this gives you an outlet outside of the church. And the last thing I have for you is a little bibliotherapy. 2 books that have been particularly helpful for me, that are well written and are very accessible and are very useful, are Feeling Good, the New Mood Therapy by Dr. David Burns, and the Anxiety and Phobia Workbook by Dr. Edmund Bourne. I really highly commend those to you. So there you have it, a brief overview of stress and anxiety and depression. And these things are often overwhelming for us because we're in a career that is uniquely stressful and demanding. That is a career marked by high ideals, but sometimes has a little bit of a lack of training in the realities of day-to-day church life. And because we're in a career where we often have little to no support when the stress builds. And all 3 of those create a triple threat that can exacerbate issues with which we struggle. So I'm curious, what questions do you have? Anyone? Any questions?
I got a question, Todd.
Yes, go for it.
I wonder what advice you have. I've done this on small things. Like I used to get really anxious before preaching and grow over time of being able to channel that into energy.
Mm-hmm.
So I look forward to it now. And I wonder what tips you might have, or if it's possible with larger stressors to channel that stress and anxiety in different ways.
Okay. So one thing that I always recommend to people is if something is happening that is stressful for you, before it happens, practice some deep breathing. So if you're stressed about preaching while the other lessons are being read, just start going into those really deep diaphragm-based breaths in and out, because our bodies associate deep breathing with calm. And so we take some time to calm ourselves, and that can help lower that feeling of anxiety. I'll confess to you all that for me, council meetings sometimes feel like they can go off the rails at any moment. And I sit in meetings and just continue to breathe deeply in and out, so that I can maintain some control. And I don't always do the best in the world, P.S. But deep breathing is a good thing to do, and addressing the cognitive distortions. So often we're anxious because we're saying things to ourselves like, I'm not very good at this. And that's where we need to start sifting the evidence. What proof do we have that we're not very good at it? And so what we often find is that we have plenty of proof that we are good at it. And saying, oh my gosh, I'm really anxious about preaching because I'm not. We say, wait, no, I've been trained in this. Writing 1,500 words every week, for a year or for however long we've served, takes it out of anybody. That everything doesn't have to be a home run. All these different ways that we kind of talk back to that anxiety and let go of that cognitive distortion. Does that help?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
I'm muted. Other questions?
Todd, I sort of get go ahead, Jason.
Hey, Jason, I can't. Feel free to type your comment in the chat, and I'll see if I can, or your question in the chat, and I'll see if I can answer it. Okay, Russell.
Yeah, while he's doing that, I'm curious about earlier in the conversation you talked about sort of qualitative type stuff, like you didn't stay long enough for my visit, you didn't preach a good sermon, your sermon offended me type thing. How does your background in counseling sort of inform those sorts of things when you have those conversations with people? Because oftentimes I get caught up in those stressors as well too. But you talked about, I've been trained to do these things and starting to think about the evidence and things like that. A lot of times the stuff that I find that people, for lack of a better phrase, argue or fuss at me about or more the qualitative things like what you were talking about as opposed to quantitative sort of stuff. How does
Okay.
your sorry, I'm rambling here, but how does your discipline as a counselor inform that in terms of when you're working with patient or working with clients, in terms of how do you measure those sorts of things in terms of effectiveness and treatment and other things like that?
Okay. So let me make sure I understand. Are you asking how I know those things are effective when I'm doing counseling work, or how I deal with it myself as a pastor?
Well, I think just how has your background in counseling informed that when you get those sorts of cognitive distortions in your own thinking of, well, Mrs. Jones is mad at me because I didn't stay long enough for her hospital visit, sort of thing.
Right. So no doubt you'll quote me the proverb, physician, heal thyself. One of the hardest things for me to do is to translate some of my counseling stuff into my work in the church, because as it is for all of us, my identity is tied up in being a pastor, and when something hits close to our identity. So I sometimes get caught up in the same things. Oh no, she's mad at me because I didn't visit long enough, or oh my gosh, I offended this person or that person. On my best days, which I again hear as like not often, if someone comes with something like that, what I try to do is say, oh, tell me more about that, right? If I can get them to expand on what they mean, usually they're not actually ticked off because I didn't stay long enough. Usually they're feeling neglected by the church as a whole, right? People aren't coming by enough. People aren't checking on me enough, that kind of stuff. I mentioned this before, another fantastic question is, what would you like me to do with that information? What would you like me to do with that information? Puts it on them to say, gosh, well, I guess I just wanted you to know, or I'd really like you to spend a little more time with me next time, or something like that. It's hard to do in the moment because it feels like somebody is coming at us with a critique. And if when we feel critiqued, I call it walls up, claws up, right? That we go into defensive mode, and finding a way to say, all right, so she's upset with me that I didn't stay long enough. Well, I can't be everything to everybody, right? I have no idea if that fully addresses your question or not, Russell.
Yeah, that's good enough. I mean, considering my question was kind of bumbling and rumbling in the first place anyway, so it's all good.
You're fine. That's a good question. All right, I see a question that says, in traditions that encourage or require a mutual ministry or pastor-parish relations community, what guidance would you give to make those effective ministry support rather than terrible funnels of criticism and stress? That could be a webinar in and of itself. y'all, I hate mutual ministry committees. That I think that to prevent that from happening, unfortunately, it falls to us to toe the line. That when we get to the meeting and somebody goes, well, you need to know, Pastor, we cut it off and we say, no, I'm sorry. The only way I can respond to that stuff is if a person comes to me individually. If they're not willing to come to me individually, I am not willing to create a triangle where I respond to you and you take it back to them. So it comes with that setting boundaries piece. That if our churches, because I know some of us are in churches that insist that we have a mutual ministry committee. The other thing I'd recommend is that you always be allowed to handpick your mutual ministry committee. Who are the people who are your supporters and cheerleaders and the people that you have some level of trust with, so that mutual ministry is less about here's what people are complaining and more about you having a small group of 4 to 6 to say, okay, here's the vision. Here's what I'd like to see, how I'd like to see this church move forward. How can we do that together? How can the 6 of you go out and recruit 6 more people to be a part of that? And so I think mutual ministry committees are so based in we've got to have a way to critique the pastor, that we need to shift what those are. And the only people who are going to make the shift are the pastors themselves. In a couple parishes I've served, have actually said, I'm just not doing this anymore. People know how to get in touch with me if they have concerns. We're dissolving this meeting, and most people look at me and go, thank God I didn't want to have one more meeting each month anyway. It's a tough system that encourages that kind of thing. I think it's a holdover from previous years that we can let go of. Jason says he wants one definition, or one definition of depression is repressed anger. He contends that clergy deal with depression because they are not equipped for managing anger and frustration. So could you talk about clergy anger and the ways clergy can manage and express frustration or anger in healthier ways? Jason, that's a great question. What's interesting is that particularly among men, depression manifests as anger. In children, it manifests as irritability. Particularly among men, it manifests as anger. So whenever someone presents as angry, I always want to kind of see which came first. Are they angry or are they depressed? What are ways clergy can manage and express frustration and anger? I wish it were healthy for us to do so in our churches. But I think when we're angry, being able to sit at a council meeting without raising our voices and without kind of losing control to say, I feel angry and I feel angry about this. When we own it and we name it and we identify what is angering us and what we would like the solution to be, then it invites people in more than you people make me angry when you do this. In terms of managing it ourselves, scream into a pillow, throw tennis balls at the side of the house, take a picture out of the directory of the person who is the thorn in your side, tape it to the wall, and throw wet paper towels at it until your arm hurts. Sometimes with anger, we have to physically get it out, or we're not going to do anything with it but react to it. And what I often tell people with anger, we need to respond to our anger. We don't need to react to it, because when I react in anger, it's when I usually end up like in a council Zoom meeting 2 months ago doing this and saying, you people aren't listening to me. Yeah, you know what? Not helpful. So responding instead of reacting. That's the quick sort of answer to that. Okay. other questions that you all have? Okay. What topics do you want to hear in these things? What would be helpful for you?
Todd, you had mentioned, and I put it in the chat, you talked about the sense of loneliness.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a way, I mean, for one of these or what have you, to kind of expand on that as well. I know that
Sure.
would be very beneficial for me.
Okay. Absolutely. That's a great one. Clergy loneliness.
I think
What about
for
others? Okay.
one thing we really helpful is since you have a much bigger background in counseling than I do, certainly. When is the line between when we can help as pastors and when we need to turn them over to someone who's certified, licensed?
Okay. So maybe some words on when to refer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And how to find good people to refer them to.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. Other topics you'd like to hear addressed?
I had someone recently tell me about a mental health first aid class, and I don't know anything about that, and I think that's kind of what you're doing here with us, but just something along those, just real basic mental health first aid stuff, kind of a wide range of problems that we could run across, maybe.
Okay. Good. So, I tell you what, let me go back to this. My email is, and it's not on here, and I apologize that it's not. It's todd@watersedgecounseling.com. So you see the website up there, todd@watersedgecounseling.com. Feel free to email me as other topics come up that you'd be interested in. Also, am I drawing all over my screen? Yeah, oh, ta-da. Also, please know that if you're in the Savannah area, we do welcome referrals at Water's Edge. There's the number, there's the web page. All of our counselors are certified in telehealth, so we can treat throughout the state of Georgia. And there's still some freedom to do that across state lines, but anytime that emergency measures are lifted, we would lose that. I encourage you to check out the Facebook page. Most of you are going to get an email asking you to sign up or receive messages from AWeber. We use this to just push out information to people about mental health issues. And our next webinar will be on August the 6th, 2020. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to be here and to be present. And again, if there's any other questions that you have, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm going to jet back through the chat here to make sure that there's nothing else that you guys raised that you want me to respond to. Jason, I hope your COVID test is okay. That's a lot to deal with. Yeah, okay, I'm not seeing anything else. So thank you all for taking the time to be a part of this. And remember, here's your positive message. You're doing a good job. You're good pastors. You're doing what you need to do. And I am grateful to know that I have colleagues like you all spread out across these great United States. So I will hopefully see you all again next month, and we'll pick up a new topic then, okay? All right, thank you everybody. Take good care.